In December 2025, a study was published in the journal PLOS One that followed a very specific group of women. Not women who had given up on their health, not women who were sedentary or struggling to find motivation, but women who had built their entire lives around fitness. Runners, cyclists, swimmers, triathletes, 187 of them, all between 40 and 60 years old, all training at minimum 3 days a week without interruption. Women for whom exercise wasn't something they did when they felt like it was who they were. So when the researchers looked at what was happening to these women's bodies during menopause, they expected the data to show that consistent training was protecting them, that the hours they had put in, the races they had trained for, the discipline they had maintained for years, that all of it was keeping the weight off the way it always had. What the data actually showed was that 67% of these athletes had gained significant weight, not in spite of their training, alongside it. The women who were doing everything that fitness culture had ever told them to do were still gaining weight, and the harder they pushed, the worse it got. Hi, welcome to My Daily Body, and in this video we're going to go through exactly what the researchers found, why the exercise most women count on stops working after menopause, and what the science actually supports instead. Okay, so the study was led by Dr. Heather Hamilton at Old Dominion University in Virginia, and it asked these 187 athletes something that sports science had never properly investigated at this scale. Not whether they were experiencing menopause symptoms, because that was expected, but whether those symptoms were interfering with the training they had built their lives around. The answers documented a picture that contradicted everything these women had been told about what a lifetime of fitness would protect them from. Sleep problems were reported by 88% of the athletes, physical and mental exhaustion by 83%, anxiety by 72%, depressive mood by 67%, and weight gain, the symptom that sits at the center of this study's findings, was reported by 67% of the women. 2 out of every 3 elite female athletes in this study had gained significant weight during their menopause transition, despite maintaining their training without interruption. But the finding that the researchers noted most specifically was not just how many women were affected, it was what those women said the weight gain was doing to their performance. Weight gain was listed as one of the primary reasons these athletes were struggling to train and compete at their previous level. The thing they had spent years working to prevent, using the exact tool they had always been told would prevent it, was happening to them anyway. The exercise that was doing this to them was cardio. The long run, the spin class, the early morning swim, the triathlon training block, the exact form of exercise that every doctor, every trainer, and every piece of conventional fitness advice has told women over 40 to do more of, the thing most associated in the public imagination with burning fat and managing weight. These were not women doing it casually or inconsistently. They were elite endurance athletes doing it at levels most people never reach, and it was making their menopause weight gain worse, not better. The harder they trained, the more pronounced the problem became. That is what the data showed. And to understand why, you have to understand what happens inside a postmenopausal body during a cardio session that is completely different from what happened in that same body 10 years earlier. See, for most of a woman's adult life, cardio and cortisol worked together in a predictable way. Cortisol is the body's primary stress hormone, the signal that tells the body a physical demand is being placed on it and that resources need to be mobilized to meet it. When a woman ran or cycled or swam, cortisol rose in response to the effort, and then estrogen stepped in and regulated that cortisol back down once the session ended. So estrogen, in this context, was not just a reproductive hormone, it was functioning as a cortisol regulator, the biological signal that told the adrenal glands the demand had passed and the body could return to its recovery state. In that recovery state, fat was burned, muscle was repaired, and the body adapted to the training the way decades of exercise science said it should. Now, after menopause, estrogen is no longer there to perform that regulatory function. That's why when a postmenopausal woman wakes up in the morning and goes for a run, her cortisol is already elevated. Cortisol is one of the primary hormones responsible for waking the body from sleep, and then it spikes higher during the session itself. But without estrogen to bring it back down afterward, that cortisol stays elevated not for the 40 minutes it would have before menopause, but for several hours. Long after the session ends, long after she's showered, long after breakfast, the body is still reading a cortisol signal that says emergency, threat, conservation mode. In conservation mode, the body does not burn fat, it stores it. And it stores it preferentially in the abdomen because visceral fat cells, the deep belly fat that surrounds the organs, contain a higher concentration of cortisol receptors than fat cells anywhere else in the body. They were designed to respond to cortisol. When cortisol stays chronically elevated across days and weeks of cardio training, those cells fill up. The woman running every morning to prevent belly fat is, in a postmenopausal hormonal environment, running a program that fills those cells rather than empties them. There is a second mechanism compounding the first one, and it makes the outcome progressively harder to reverse the more consistently she trains. Before menopause, estrogen played a direct role in protecting lean muscle mass. It signaled the body to prioritize muscle repair after exercise and to hold onto the metabolically expensive tissue that training had built. Muscle is the primary engine of resting metabolism. A woman with more muscle burns more calories at rest every hour of every day than a woman with less muscle, independent of any exercise she is doing. Estrogen was protecting that engine. After menopause, that protection is gone. The body begins losing muscle at a rate of 3 to 5% per decade, even under normal circumstances. And without estrogen to moderate that loss, it accelerates, particularly in the context of intense and frequent cardio training that is simultaneously keeping cortisol elevated. When cortisol is chronically high and the body needs fuel to sustain the demands of training, it turns to muscle tissue as an available energy source and breaks it down. The athlete who is running every morning to get leaner is watching her body consume the very tissue that would have made her leaner. Her muscle declines, her resting metabolism slows, her fat increases. She trains harder because harder is what training culture has always taught her, and the harder she trains, the more cortisol she produces, and the deeper the cycle goes. Now, this is the exact point where I have to add the piece this study does not get to, because the study was looking at exercise, but the cycle it just described cannot be broken with exercise alone. Think about what you just heard. The core problem is that muscle, your metabolic engine, is being broken down and lost. So the answer has to involve rebuilding and protecting that muscle. But here is what almost nobody connects. Muscle is not built by the workout. The workout is only the signal. Muscle is rebuilt afterward, out of what you eat. And the single raw material your body needs most to do that rebuilding is protein. And most women over 40 are eating nowhere near enough of it. So they can do everything the science says, lift the weights, protect their recovery, and still hand their body almost nothing to rebuild that engine with. That is exactly why we created the Menopause Protein Bundle. It is the eating side of everything this research points to. Done-for-you, high-protein meals built for a post-menopausal body. Breakfasts, lunches, and dinners designed to give your muscle the raw material it needs to rebuild while keeping your blood sugar calm and steady through the day. And yes, even desserts and smoothies that satisfy a craving without the crash. Every recipe is ready in about 10 minutes, there's nothing to track and nothing to count, and every single one is built to work with your hormones instead of against them. You just open it and cook. So please, check out the link in the description, because this could be the moment you stop running a program that fills those belly fat cells and start feeding the engine that empties them. The moment all the work you put in finally moves in the direction you have been trying to go for years, instead of quietly against you. The study's researchers were direct about what the findings mean for how exercise advice for postmenopausal women needs to change, and the broader research supports a clear direction. A meta-analysis of 101 studies involving 5,697 postmenopausal women found that resistance train produced the most significant improvements in muscle mass and metabolic outcomes in this population, not endurance training, not cardio. Lifting weights. The reason is simply mechanistic. A well-structured resistance training session elevates cortisol briefly in response to the training stimulus and then allows it to resolve within a manageable window. The body receives the signal to adapt, the muscle tissue is stressed and recovers, and the cortisol does not stay elevated long enough to trigger the fat storage response that prolonged cardio produces. So every pound of muscle built through resistance training also functions as metabolically active tissue around the clock, improving insulin sensitivity, burning calories at rest, and working against the hormonal forces that are driving fat accumulation. Low-intensity movement, walking, easy cycling, gentle swimming at a genuinely comfortable pace also serves a specific function that high-intensity cardio does not. At lower intensities, fat metabolism is activated without triggering the prolonged cortisol cascade that locks fat into place afterward. It does not feel demanding enough to produce results, which is why most women dismiss it. But in a postmenopausal hormonal environment, the body responds to low-intensity movement in a way that aligns with its metabolic reality rather than working against it. Recovery, not lighter training, not active recovery, but genuine, unscheduled rest is the third shift the data consistently supports. Every cardio session that does not fully resolve before the next one begins adds to the cumulative cortisol burden. Women who are training 5 and 6 days a week in a postmenopausal body are often creating a situation where cortisol never returns to baseline between sessions, a chronic elevation that the visceral fat cells surrounding their organs read as a permanent emergency requiring continuous storage. Training 3 days a week with full recovery between sessions is, for many of these women, more effective for fat loss than training daily and remaining chronically cortisol elevated throughout. So, when you really think about it, the 187 athletes in the study were not doing anything wrong by the standards of everything they had ever been taught. They were consistent, disciplined, and committed at a level that most people never reach. And 2 out of every 3 of them had gained significant weight during their menopause transition in spite of all of it, because the exercise they were doing, the exercise that had worked for decades, was interacting with their postmenopausal hormonal environment in a way that produced the opposite of the intended outcome. The cardio wasn't wrong for who they used to be, but the hormonal context it was operating inside had changed, and nobody had told them that when that context changes, the approach has to change with it. Not because they failed, because the science that should have explained this to them had simply never been done at the scale and specificity that this study finally provided. That is what 187 athletes spent their menopause transitions discovering without anyone warning them it was coming. And it is what this study, published in December 2025, finally documented in terms specific enough to change the conversation.